Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 102, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I'm going to keep this week's updates a little bit short because I have an interview today and it does go close to an hour, so I'm not going to talk very much at the beginning. I will tell you that November seems to be the month of coats. I'm working on several different coat patterns. Other women collect shoes. I seem to have a thing for coats. And now that I can sew my own clothing, I'm venturing out into the world of coats. And you'll hear more about the projects in the next couple of episodes. But I'm having a lot of fun. So let's jump right in. My guest this week is Nicole Nehrig, and she is a clinical psychologist and the author of With Her Own Hands, Women Weaving Their Stories. And from Nicole's website, which I will link in the show notes, comes this description, which I think sums up the book very well. The book integrates psychological theory and practice with historical accounts and firsthand stories of the meaningful role that textile work has played in so many women's lives. Let's hear from Nicole herself about how the book came about. It's a very interesting story, and I think you'll appreciate it. I am here with Nicole Nehrig, who is the author of the book With Her Own Hands. And we're going to have a great conversation today about women in textiles and using those textiles to communicate and create identity. And I think we'll have lots to talk about. So welcome to the podcast, Nicole.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks for having me.
So you are a clinical psychologist currently in private practice. And at the time that the pandemic hit, you were working in a VA hospital. And it sounds like you had a pretty high-powered job, and then your world was upended, like the rest of us. But
Right.
you have a very interesting story to tell about that. So let's start there.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't say it was necessarily a high-powered job, but it was a very busy job. I was a clinical and research psychologist. I was working to develop treatments for veterans who didn't respond to kind of the typical CBT treatments that the VA provided for depression and trauma. And so I was, you know, seeking grant funding and doing research projects and also teaching at NYU med school and seeing um, patients and teaching the trainees and supervising. So I was wearing lots of hats. It was very busy and varied and kind of never ended. It was, something I could be working at in any spare moment of the day. There was always something to do. And I had also two small children at the time when the pandemic hit. They were 3 and 5. So my life was completely full, like to the brim and overflowing. I was always a knitter and I knit in like research meetings and on the subway on my commutes to work and when I was watching movies with the kids and things like that. But it was very much kind of in the um, done alongside other things. And then the pandemic hit, and knitting was still something that I could do alongside other things. And it was really the only thing that I could do for myself because there wasn't time, there hadn't really been time before for much time for myself alone. But, I did go out with friends here and there for dinners or, have some moments to myself after the kids went to bed where maybe I wasn't always working. And then with needing to kind of try to do a full-time job and full-time childcare, at the same time, there was really not a spare minute, but I could still knit because it was something I could do while I was with my kids. and still sometimes during Zoom meetings for work. So knitting kind of took on new meaning for me because it was really the only thing that I could do for me, and it was really holding me together in ways. And research went by the wayside. It was something that had to, kind of be put on pause during the pandemic. We couldn't run research subjects, and then it was also, you know, something that wasn't immediately necessary, whereas, of course, patient care was immediately necessary, child care was immediately necessary. So I was finding that knitting was fulfilling parts of my myself that were had been fulfilled through research. Like research had been kind of the main place I channeled my intellectual and creative energies, and knitting was now that. I was, figuring out new ways to new like techniques in knitting. I taught myself how to make socks and was playing with different ways to turn a heel. I was kind of like challenging myself in my knitting, and it really made me think about the ways that um, textile work offers a lot in terms of creative, intellectual fulfillment, social connection, also emotional processing, grounding, mindfulness, all of these things that I was so needing during that time and didn't get to fulfill in the usual avenues that I had fulfilled them, which then made me think about the role this work has played for women throughout history and around the world, and got me interested in what eventually became With Her Own Hands. But at the time was just like, oh, I'm curious to learn more about this and wonder how my experience, is similar to, different than the experience of other women throughout history who have done this work and maybe found fulfillment in it, or maybe didn't. Maybe it was a dreaded chore for some people. But maybe other people found a lot of fulfillment and a place to work out their ideas and a way to express themselves, or a way to manage their emotions or find community and connection. And I was curious about that. So, yeah, that got me researching this topic and eventually deciding to write this book.
You say that you were always a knitter. How old were you when you learned? Do you remember?
Yeah, I shouldn't say I was always a knitter. I came to it later, than many. I didn't learn as a child. I taught myself when I was 25. And as a kid, I was always doing things with my hands, though. I didn't have a family that did a lot of textile crafts. But I liked drawing. I liked making, beaded necklaces and bracelets and friendship bracelets with embroidery thread. And I did a lot of pottery, and by high school, I was doing pottery pretty seriously in a pottery studio at my school, which happened to be a really phenomenal pottery studio with a wonderful teacher. But at home, even I was, making Sculpey figures and little beads and things like that. So I've always liked doing things with my hands. And if I had had like a knitting mom or grandma, I'm sure I would have loved to learn that at a young age. But as it was really by accident. And I kind of picked up this teach yourself how to knit kit at a hobby store when I was 25, and thought, okay, like I'll give this a try. And it was a bit of a struggle because I had to teach myself, and learned by this little booklet that was included in the kit, which was like only a little bit helpful because it told you kind of what to do, but not what not to do, and like didn't tell you how to fix mistakes or anything. But thankfully, YouTube had just started at that time. And so I could watch YouTube videos, and I was cobbling it together and figuring out how to knit on my own. And thankfully I was able to figure it out, and then I was hooked.
As you were describing your experience during the pandemic, I was thinking back to when we moved to Montana. I had been working in Baltimore for a software company as a, it was a full-time job, and then we had our first daughter. And she was a year old when we moved to Montana. And I went out to try to get a job similar to what I had been doing at the software company. And I was offered a position, and the gentleman who was interviewing me said, "And we're prepared to pay you $5 an hour."
What?
And granted, this was in 1993 in Montana, but I said, that's nowhere near what I was making in Baltimore. And he said, well, this isn't the East Coast. And so I came home and I was telling my husband about this, and he said, you're always knitting. Can you figure out some way to make money from your knitting? So it's fascinating to me how, as you pointed out, something that for hundreds of years women had to do because they would be naked otherwise, or their
Mhm.
families would be naked if they didn't create the clothing, if they didn't spin the yarn, dye the yarn, weave the yarn, all of that. But now it has morphed into something where we almost have a luxury to be able to do those kinds of things and to create that kind of a career by choice.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really in some parts of the world, it's like less and less so. It's still necessary and or it's, has like a deeper meaning, culturally or something. And, you would wear only the hand woven cloth to particular important events, or, you gift handmade cloth as part of a social exchange for weddings or funerals or something. And it is like this kind of necessary thing still, although less and less. And, it's not necessary maybe that every woman do this work anymore. Some women do it, and then you can buy their cloth to gift to for these important social exchanges and everything. But yes, in our world, it's very much a choice. And so it's interesting when you meet people who do this work here or, in most of Europe or something, like people are like so passionate about it because they've chosen it. Nobody's just like, oh yeah, I kind of knit because it's like what I'm supposed to do, or it's what like my grandma did or what my mom did. And everybody is like, oh, like I knit, I love it. I have this yarn stash, or I quilt and I have this fabric stash, and all I want to do is go to quilt shows, and all I want to do is, shop for fabric. And for me, like I don't like shopping at all except for creative materials. Like it's the only thing that gives me joy to buy. And when I travel, it's the only kind of thing I want to look for. I don't want to buy souvenirs or, clothes, or it's like only I want to get some special yarn or cloth or something from this place where I am, something that I couldn't get and remember then like, oh, this is the fabric I bought in Portugal and this is the yarn I bought in Scotland when I visited. Like that's so meaningful to me. And yeah, it becomes this passion. And it is a luxury and for many, or it's a way of making an income and, taking what you love and being able to make it a career, which is incredible.
What sparked the idea for a book?
It was really, I had this interest, and I wanted to know the answers to my questions, which were like, how did women use this work to create meaning in their lives? And I read a lot of things, and my gosh, I realized just how many things were written about this, about textile work and women's role in textile work. But there wasn't a lot that was about the individual woman. It was, how textile work was economically important or drove technological advances in the world, or, things from an archaeological perspective, looking at like the development of textile techniques over time or something, or the types of materials that were used and the development of different weave patterns and structures. And so these are all fascinating things, but it didn't get to my particular interest, which, as a psychologist, I'm more interested in like the individual person's experience rather than kind of a collective trend or, you can see over 500 years this kind of thing evolving. I really wanted to know, like, for any given woman in any given place at any given time, you know, what was she getting out of this? What did it do for her? How did it feel to her? And so that was a trickier thing to find. And so then I thought, well, like I've been a researcher all these years. Like I know in research you look for gaps in the literature and then try to fill them. And so I had found a gap, and it was a gap that I really, really answer to, and really wanted to dig into myself. And so I figured, well, maybe I'll try to write something about this. And I started researching it. The first couple of years, I didn't know that I would be able to write a book, that I would get a book deal, and but I wanted to research and learn and try to write something about it, and to have these answers to these questions that I had. And so it had to be kind of cobbled together between the historical accounts and present day accounts, because not surprisingly, a lot of people were not asked, 1,000 years ago, like, what does textile work mean to you? And hey, like you're doing all this weaving, you're spending like 10 hours a day spinning or weaving or processing wool or dyeing wool or something, like, how does this fulfill you? It was such a kind of compulsory activity. And, I don't know that many people thought much about those things for themselves necessarily anyway. Like, in what ways is this work fulfilling me? That's maybe a somewhat more modern concept. And then people didn't think to write down a lot about women's experiences, and women's internal lives. Anyway, women weren't often writing them down. Sometimes they were. And I found some great accounts of women writing about their experiences, including, what it meant to embroider to them. And there's a wonderful account in The Subversive Stitch by Rosika Parker, where this woman, Grace Sherrington, who I think was living in the 1600s or early 1700s, and she said, every day I like to spend a little time embroidering just my own ideas, from my own mind. Or like a bowl of fruit, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to kind of just like free embroider, like freely, not from a pattern or, existing design, but just like from my own mind. She was kind of painting with thread, doing like, something very artistic and creative and of her own mind. So I found some wonderful accounts like that. But I also then talked to women doing this work in the present in different places in the world, to understand what this work means to them, and then wonder about, historically, maybe it was the same in some regard.
I'm laughing a little to myself because I'm imagining somebody asking me what cooking means to me because I
Hmm.
don't like to cook.
Right,
Cooking is a chore for me.
right,
Um, and I suspect that maybe for some women, textile arts were a chore.
for sure.
I'm reminded of a quilting book that I looked through, and one of the quilts in it was credited to a Mrs. Thomas so and so. And I thought to myself, how awful that that woman has not, she doesn't have an identity
Hmm.
aside from her husband.
Hmm.
And I had older women say to me, but that was the etiquette of the time. I get that. It was the etiquette of the time, but still it seemed to push under the surface the contribution of women.
Hmm.
That's one of the things that I'm really appreciating about your book is how you're bringing that to the forefront. So you traveled apparently and talked to a lot of women
Hmm.
around the world, I assume.
Hmm.
It sounds like. How did that inform the book? Did it drive the narrative?
Yeah, I don't think I really had like a set narrative in mind going into this. It was very informed by what I learned as I went. I did have this idea. The general idea was um, to see what textile work meant to women, and how it fulfilled certain kind of human needs, right? Like if we think about like we have a need for social connection. We have a need to feel like our work is valued and makes a contribution in some way. Most of us like to use our minds in some way and feel satisfaction in learning and developing our minds and in being creative and sharing ideas and, feeling a sense of self and developing a sense of identity. Like these are kind of so that like loosely, those I kind of went into that. For some people, religion is really important in organizing. That felt like kind of too big a subject to get into and too varied with all the different religions in the world and the ways textiles intersect with um, religion and have in many ways throughout history. But just thinking about like what are these sources of meaning, and so I was kind of just like listening for that and asking questions that would help me understand what those sources of meaning were that textile work could fulfill for people. And then it was really like driven, data driven. What were people telling me was important about this work? And, then how do I organize and make sense out of what I'm hearing from people? And there was a lot of intersection and overlap. And so I was able to kind of say, okay, it's totally idiosyncratic for every person. Like there are areas of overlap. Many, many people said that it was, something that they used to transform their emotions, or, they would go to when they were having a hard time and it would ground them, and they would breathe better. It would relax them. It was a way to get out of their heads a bit. A lot of people talked about being able to connect with other people, that they go to knitting circles and everything. And it's not so much to be knitting, even, like knitting is a part of it, but they purposely took simple knitting projects or did tedious like weaving in the ends or sewing pieces together or something in those knitting circles so that they could have time to talk and kind of the mental space available to engage in conversation. So that, I saw a lot of these kind of areas of overlap and intersection, even cross-culturally, which was interesting and then kind of informed the structure of the book. But really, I started out just being very interested in, kind of making the assumption that for many women, this is meaningful work. And it's not just something they do. And again, I think had I done kind of a study 500 years ago, there might have been a lot of people who've been like, oh, I'd give anything to not be at the loom all day, like I'd give anything to just be able to, do this other thing that they would have preferred doing. Plenty of people would have felt that way. And of course, then there were enslaved people at various points in time who were, weaving 12 hours a day for, um, just a handful of figs or whatever little bit of food that they would get in return. There were horrible conditions. So by no means is this like every woman had found a lot of meaning and fulfillment in this work. But even so, even if the work was really tedious, in some cases, I think women told stories, they shared things, they talked to each other, they shared things with each other. I've read accounts where somebody would be kind of like singing or entertaining, a group of women as they were weaving, and so I still imagine maybe there was some way that there was maybe some comfort founded, and I kind of take the existential humanistic view that life is inherently meaningless and there's a lot of hardship and struggle, and like it's up to us to find meaning in what's available to us. And I do hope that even in the, very difficult um, conditions that many women have found themselves in over time, that maybe textile work for some offered some um, opportunity to find some moments of peace or pleasure or connection.
I was about 25, I think, 24 or 25. And I had knit, I learned to knit when I was 8 years old, and I knit constantly. I knit all the way through college, and it was just something that was always with me. And I remember being in Cleveland the night that my father was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and I sat in his hospital room and I knit a sock. And to that point, I had not ever knit a sock before. And I had, maybe looked at how to knit a sock. And so there was something in my brain maybe that said, this is how you turn a heel. Sitting there knitting a sock, processing what was going on around
Hmm.
me. Textile work can be the kind of mindless, but yet not mindless, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're engaging I knit during sermons during it in church because it's easier for me to pay attention when my hands are occupied.
Hmm.
So,
Same. I
yeah.
asked my professors in grad school if I could knit during lectures, and they always said yes. And one professor said, "Sure, as long as you knit me a hat. Like you can knit whatever you want after that, but like knit me a hat, and then feel free to knit whatever." And of course, I could knit like a hat in basically 1 2 hour lecture or something. So then the rest of the semester, I was knitting whatever I wanted. But yeah, it was great to have, my hands occupied. If I'm not knitting, I'm usually then picking at my fingernails
Me
or,
too.
fidgeting in some way. So it grounds you and like occupies some of your focus so that then maybe your mind is a little more open to receiving other things.
Our pastor said he didn't care as long as no one was sleeping.
Yeah,
So,
and knitting would keep you awake.
knitting keeps you
You know,
awake. I belong to a
my husband.
Mennonite church, and so textile work is a very strong component of that. We had,
Hmm.
unfortunately, because our congregation is getting older and the women aren't as able to do this anymore, but we had quilting gatherings where we got together and quilted. And it really does foster a sense of community. Do you think that that's part of the resurgence in interest in handicrafts is people looking for that community?
I do. And for those of us in these communities, they're really, for the most part, incredible communities. People are so supportive of each other, want to teach each other, are very welcoming. If anybody tells me they want to learn to knit, I'm like over the moon. I'm like, I get to teach you how to knit. It's like my favorite thing ever because it means so much to me and to be able to share this with somebody else. I feel like, when somebody recommends a new TV show for you or something and they're like, "Oh, like I'm jealous that you're going to get to like watch this whole thing again. I loved it so much. Like I wish I could be, in the place you are of like just being introduced to it and getting to, because I feel like, oh, you're like most people I've taught to knit really love it and continue with it. Every now and then somebody's like, my hands just don't want to do this and it feels hard and awkward and they can't get past that. But most people I'm like, oh, you're just like embarking on a journey that's going to change your life and like it's so meaningful and exciting. So I feel like that's often the case in the times that I've reached out to complete strangers on Ravelry or in some knitting group forum or something, asking for help, which I did a lot when I was first starting to knit because I really didn't know. I didn't know anybody else who knitted. So unless I went to a yarn store or something and asked for help, I had to rely on strangers. And people were so incredibly generous with me, sending me video tutorials, giving me like step-by-step advice. I remember I was about to run out of yarn for a cardigan I was making, and I found somebody on Ravelry who had use that exact yarn to make something, and I had seen that they used like 2.7 skeins of the yarn or something to make their project. And I wrote to them and said, do you by any chance have that little bit left over? I really just need like, 12 grams or something like that. And they were like, yes, I have it and I'll send it to you. And like, please, no need to pay me or reimburse me for the postage or anything. I'm just happy to help. And I was like, it's like mind blowing how supportive the communities are. And so I do think that people, find a lot of community and connection. It is wonderful that there are so many in-person knitting circles, sewing circles, quilting guilds and events that people can go to and find community. So yeah, I think that's, part of the resurgence of this during the pandemic was both looking for things that people could do to occupy themselves at home, but also ways to connect with larger communities.
I spend more time in the sewing community now than I do in the knitting community, but it seems to me that in the sewing community there is a lot of room for personal expression, and so I see the most amazing creations. People make things out of materials that I would never consider using, but what they create is clearly an expression of themselves.
Hmm.
And so I know it happens in knitting too, but I don't, because I'm not in that world so much anymore. I see it more with sewing. How do you think that, or do you think that a lot of people come to textile arts because they can't find that freedom to express themselves in maybe other activities?
Maybe. I definitely see a mix in that. And, people that I've talked to, I heard very mixed responses. Some people are very tied to following patterns. And, maybe in some sense, they like that it allows them to not have to, figure everything out on their own, that they've like gotten a pattern and somebody's done a lot of the work for them. And if they can kind of trust that, they don't have to do all that mental work to figure things out. And other people who are very, I want to completely make my own thing. I have total freedom in this, and it's very low stakes, and I can always rip it out if I don't like it, and I can experiment and play. So I think that it's mixed. I talked to a cross-stitch designer who Haley Cox Pearson, who uh, said that she had people write to her sometimes and say, like, why do you always use, like primary kinds of colors in your patterns? Like, I wish you would use like softer colors, because I prefer to work with like more pastel kinds of colors. And Haley was like, what? Like, you can do any colors you want. Like, but it was kind of like some people don't even see themselves as having permission to play in that way. If they get a pattern, they feel they have to follow the colors that are there. And I think, Haley was kind of like that never even occurred to me that people like I use those colors because I like those colors. But of course, I always just assumed that other people would use whatever colors they feel like using to make my designs. And yeah, so I think it's kind of mixed, but I do think that it does allow a lot of room to play and create. And I think in part the history of it being something that had to do with what you had available, right? Like if in quilting, these are the scraps you've got. You've got this old apron that you can cut up. You've got these bed sheets you can cut up. You've got these kids' clothes that, are worn out, but you can salvage, five little pieces of fabric from this. Like you've got what you've got, and then you've got to work with that and problem solve and figure out how to make something beautiful out of that or something that reflects some idea in your mind, the best possible arrangement of those pieces that you have available. I think that that did maybe set it up as something that could allow for kind of more play, that it doesn't need to be so prescribed, and that the pieces have to dictate a little bit what you do with them. Right nowadays, of course, you can find a quilt pattern and say, oh, I like this pattern. I like these colors, that are used. I can go out and I have my choice of, hundreds of thousands of fabric options, and I can find the exact fabrics I want, and I can buy a yard or 2 yards and, do whatever I want with it to make this quilt, but that was not the typical way that things were done. And fabric was so valuable that it was reused. You knew how much time it took to weave new fabric, and so you cobbled together whatever you could from the fabric you had left and repurposed it in all of these ways, so that there is this kind of then creativity. A pattern can't quite dictate what you do. You've got to work with what you've got and figure out how to make it. And it's interesting that people so often did then make beautiful designs out of these bits of leftover cloth and everything, that they didn't just haphazardly sew them together and say, okay, like I'll make a blanket, it'll function as a blanket. People like really still wanted to make, some kind of beautiful, aesthetically pleasing design in whatever way they could with what they had. It's really fascinating. That to me, that's like the human drive to problem solve, to, create something beautiful, to imbue something with your own statement, your own personal aesthetic or ideas, or some kind of culturally important meaning or something. It wasn't just for necessity. And I think that's very clear with textile work, that as long as it took to make it, um, it was still embellished upon and, made interesting and beautiful. It was not just for survival.
My husband often asks me when I'm starting a new project, a new quilt, he'll say, "And what would Ma Ingalls say about that?" Because he knows he teases me about cutting up large pieces of fabric and sewing into small pieces of fabric and
To
sewing them
sew them
back
back
into a
together
large
into a
piece of
large piece.
fabric. Right.
Yeah. Again, we use it somewhat differently now. Although lots of quilters, like I don't like throwing anything away. I like keeping every little bit of fabric, and I'm always like, I'm gonna find something to do with that. I remember interviewing a quilter in Gee's Bend, Alabama, and she said sometimes I'd like have a little piece, and I'd be like, no, this I'm not going to keep. It's too small, and I'd throw it in the dustbin, and then I'd like walk by it several times, and I'd end up pulling it out and being like, nope, I'll find a purpose for that. But it's really hard to let go of these scraps, because there's this sense of potential. And, even when I'm just snipping off little corners, I've started doing some English paper piecing. And so, you cut a little square, and then you cut the hexagon, and then like you're just like cutting these little triangles off the corners or something. And they're really probably too small to sew with. I can't even imagine like hand piecing these little things together. What would I make? But then I'm like, maybe I'll like do some kind of collage where I'm like gluing them down, and like I can make some beautiful picture, with these glued down, and some collage type thing. And I don't do that. Like I've never done a fabric collage with glue or something, but I'm like, maybe I'll save them and we'll see. There's a sense of potential, and I don't want to let go of that sense of potential.
You just finished a book tour for the book. What plans do you have going forward? Are you going to write another book? Are you going to dabble in more textile arts? What's coming down the pike?
Yeah, I hope both of those things. The book tour is slowing down. I wouldn't say it's completely over. I still have a number of events. I have one this Friday. I have, I have some booked out even into April of next year, but certainly through December, I have a number of things booked. So I haven't really gotten that time to sit and think about another book quite yet. I have some loose ideas clinking around in my brain, but I haven't had time to like really explore them in depth to see if they could be a book or would be a book I'd want to write. But definitely it was like a highlight of my life writing this book. Incredibly meaningful experience to me, and I would love to have the opportunity to do another one. This was such a very particularly personally meaningful book and like integrating book for me, bringing together my love of textiles with my work as a psychologist. Like it just felt like it brought together all of these parts of myself. I had been a double major in art and psychology in undergrad, and like it just like felt like it brought a whole lot of things full circle, things that it was like, well, like, why did I do that? Why, like, um, you know, I didn't become an artist, uh, but like it, yeah, it just kind of like brought all these things together. So I would love to find something like that to write about in the future, but we'll see. Um, I would love to have more time for textile crafts, and this has really opened up um, like new ways for me of engaging with textile work that, I had really been a knitter, and I did a little bit of sewing. But sewing was like a very like on and off kind of thing for me. I would do it, I'd be really into it for like 6 months or something, and then like I wouldn't sew for 4 years. So I've been sewing much more consistently. I am finally quilting, which is something I've always wanted to do, and like envied, people who quilted and felt like I just couldn't really like get into it or find a way in. And then I found a way in this research, by being exposed to different ways of quilting and like really learning about the different ways people approach this. Because I think the like pattern quilting of like making all of these blocks and like doing above half square triangles and stuff like didn't really um I just couldn't stay with it. I will say now I started a quilt with a bunch of quarter square triangles during the pandemic, and I made one block. And I cut out a whole bunch of pieces, other pieces for the other blocks. And then I put it by the wayside because I was like, oh, boy, this just doesn't feel like it's for me. And recently, a friend who's a great quilter was over, and she looked at like the stack of things I had cut out already. And she was like, Nicole, this will come together in no time. You should just put this together, and it's a Christmas themed quilt. And she's like, Christmas is coming, like just make it the deadline, and like really just get it done, and you can enjoy it this holiday season and everything. And so I'm like pedal to the metal with this. And she's right, it is coming together quickly, and I'm actually enjoying it more than I thought I would. But yeah, I've been exposed to so much more, and there's like so much more that I want to do and want to try, and it's really opened up um my practice, and I'm excited to like play in things, and I'm finding that different textile practices give me different things, and knitting, because I've kind of reached um a skill level with it where like I'm I'm pretty good at it, and I can make sweaters that fit me well and are intricate and everything. In knitting, I kind of like really want to make things that look nice. And I'm more concerned about the end product. I still have some process in there where I'm like, okay, I want something complicated. I want like a good color work. Project that I've got to pay attention to, or I'm going to like do this vintage lace pattern that I've got to really pay attention to. And other times I'm like, I just want like something really easy, a really easy color work project where I'm just like knitting, two pink, one white, three pink, one white, something really or just stockinette. But in these other things, because my skill level's not that high, it offers me a little more room to play and explore and be like, like it'll be what it is. And, we'll just kind of see, and I can play with it and experiment and be more in the process. So that's been kind of fun and exciting. Like I've started spinning a little bit, and I'm really not good at spinning. I'm really not good at it. And I can't say that I like love it and it's going to be like a thing that I do, a big thing that I do, but it's fun that I don't feel like I'm like whatever yarn I create is great. Like I'm not attached to the end product so much. I would like to get better at it. I would like to, feel like I can have a little bit more control over what I'm creating and everything. But it's also kind of like, I don't know, I can just do this for like 10 or 15 minutes and it's something that like I don't have to worry about the outcome and whatever I create is going to be like something and I can, I'll use it for some kind of project at some point and but I'm not thinking about like I really want this to be like a nice finished sweater that I can wear. It's not going to be that. Like it's um but maybe it's like a chunky, bumpy, lumpy headband or something at some point that I wear when I'm like hiking in the woods, and I can feel very pleased. It'll keep my ears warm, and I'll feel like I spun this and stuff. But I don't need to be so attached to the outcome.
I hear in what you just said the premise for a book on process versus product.
That would be interesting.
I find that fascinating because I'm like you, I go back and forth. Sometimes I just want to produce stuff, and sometimes I really want to dig in and understand the technique. So I think there's room for both, although I do think
Hmm.
people lean one way or the other. I was very much a
Definitely.
process knitter. You know, technique was technique was it. That was one of the things that drew me to sewing, I think, was being able to create something in a much shorter period of time.
Yeah, and that's been interesting for me. The time I've changed my relationship to time in the process of writing this book because I have done things that take a lot of time, are not really ultimately that productive. For a while, for me, alongside my busy hospital job, knitting was like a productivity thing too. And I would have a knitting to-do list a lot of times. Well, I have to get this baby sweater done for this friend. She's due in June. And like that's on my to-do list. And then I want to knit, for holiday charity organizations that like distribute hats to people in the winter or something. So I've got to get like, 10 hats done by that time. And I just like had all of these things like it was like really tied to this productivity mindset that I had at the time. And then when I started sewing again, in the context of writing this book, and again, I've like been a wannabe quilter for a long time, and I was like, I'm gonna find a way to be a quilter. And I realized that I actually like English paper piecing because it's portable the way knitting is portable. And it was really hard for me to find dedicated time to be at my sewing table, like doing all the cutting and being at my machine for more like traditional machine quilting. And so I was like, okay, well, this is like the least efficient way of doing quilting. Like it takes me forever, and I'm not that skilled at hand sewing. I'm not that fast at it. And so it really is so time consuming, but it's a way that I'll actually get something done and I'll enjoy the process of it. So, and I like the way it looks. I love these like tessellating pieces. And they just produce such beautiful patterns and everything. But then I thought, well, instead of trying to make like a throw this way, which would take like 6 years, I'll do like pillowcase covers, which they still take me like a year to do. It's so like I'm really slow and I don't do it like regularly. It's again something I'll like pick up and work on for a little bit and then put down and, go to my knitting projects, and those will be the focus for a while. But it was nice to feel like, oh, I could take on kind of smaller projects. And then that led me to, I found a English paper piecing blanket pattern that I did fall in love with. And then I was like, you know what? So what if it takes me 6 years to do it? And it probably will. But like, whatever, it'll take the time it takes and I'll enjoy the process of doing it. So it really did shift me a lot into process in different aspects and to changing my relationship to time and productivity, which has been really good for me because I think, you know, productivity has been a big driver for me in my life, and giving myself time to just play and rest and have fun and experiment and everything has been really important, like to introduce back into my life. Uh, yeah, it's really changed things. I remember when I was in grad school, I met a woman who was a knitter, who was in my grad school cohort. And she said, "Oh, I'm a knitter too." And she told me the way she knitted. And it's like, I just take whatever little balls of yarn I have and I just knit them up until they're gone into some sort of square or rectangle or something. And then at the end, I just sew them all together into a blanket. And like, oh, they're like different yarn weights and like they're all different sizes and different colors. And like some are alpaca and some are like, scratchy wool and some are cotton and whatever. And like, whatever, at the end, I just have this blanket. And I was like, oh, we are very different types of knitters. Like it was like I like had never even imagined doing something like that before. I have my color work sweater patterns and I follow my patterns and I'm very neat and I like use consistent yarn throughout the project. Like it just was so different from how I knitted. And I just remember thinking like, wow, like I never even thought of approaching it like that. And I still don't do quite that, but I'm like getting to a place where like in some areas I can do something closer to that. Where it's like I just want to play and see how it feels and, try out a little swatch and see what comes of that or, spin this lumpy bumpy yarn and it'll all be kind of different and random and, I'll do something with it. So it's been freeing.
I think that's a good place to end this with the reminder that textiles meet people where they are and provide what they need.
Absolutely.
Your book and this discussion, I think, really underscores that. So I really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. It's been a lovely conversation.
Again, Nicole's book is entitled With Her Own Hands, Women Weaving Their Stories. I will warn you that this is not Twinkie reading. This is not light and fluffy, but neither is it a dry scholarly work. It is a rich tapestry, dare I use that word, and I think that you will learn things about women, you will learn things about history, you will learn things about yourself by reading this book, so I highly recommend it. I will be traveling again for Thanksgiving, but I do have podcasts recorded ahead of time, and they will be scheduled to drop on the standard Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. Thank you for the ongoing feedback. I have gotten some wonderful ideas for future podcast episodes. I've gotten some great stories from some of you, so I really appreciate the emails and the comments that I get. If you'd like to leave a comment on the Apple Podcasts website, I'd appreciate that. You can find more information about each episode at the podcast website, which is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com, and that has links to the podcast if you can't find it, as well as links to my blog and links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website. My blog is where I post pictures of what I'm working on and discussions about patterns and other things happening here in Montana. My Instagram account also has a lot of pictures, but not as much commentary. I save that for the blog, so if you're interested, check that out. I hope that those of you in the U.S. have a wonderful Thanksgiving and that all of you, no matter where you are in the world, get to go sew something.